Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we will be reviewing the Los Angeles honey processed El Salvador from Father's Coffee Roastery. And there's the bag right there. And Father's, based out of Ostrava, Czech Republic, and they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on this channel on numerous occasions, including our recent review of the Ramo, a natural processed Ethiopian coffee. And I actually purchased this coffee alongside that one, as it caught my interest for a number of reasons. The first of which being that it is a honey processed El Salvadorian coffee. And I don't think we've actually reviewed any honey processed El Salvadorian coffees on this channel before. The second reason being that the flavor profile did sound pretty interesting to me, as this one is a Pacamara as well. So for those reasons, it's a coffee that definitely caught my interest, and it'll definitely be interesting to see how it turned out. This right here is day 47. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a toned down recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 93 degrees Celsius, about 199 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee. This is yet another filter roast from Father's, who is a lighter roasting coffee roaster. So it's very much along the same lines of the experience we had with the Cramo, which is to say that this coffee is on the lighter side of things by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 20, first impression, and we did opt for the V60 as the cup did have a solid level of clarity with enough intensity to match. There were some of the listed citric lime-like aspects with a slightly earthy chocolate base. Outside of that, some more subtle fruit aspects, but definitely a good first impression, as I went into this one not necessarily expecting too much clarity given that this is a honey processed El Salvadorian coffee, but having a little higher level of clarity than initially expected was already a nice first impression. Day 23 opted for the Chemex and definitely had some mixed feelings, as this one remained on the slightly cleaner side of expectations. Though it wasn't lacking too many of the strong funky or fermenty notes, it had a little bit of a lack of definition to it in general, as there wasn't a whole lot of intensity around. There was a little bit of a generic brightness that felt citric based, but then it did taper off into a robust chocolate aspect, so not nearly as much depth, lending itself to a less impressive second try. Continue on to day 26 as we opted for the April brewer, and here we have our third shift in this coffee, as now it's offering significantly greater clarity, definition, and structure, as there's a much better defined chocolate base to the cup. Fruit brightness is in the cleaner sense, with the listed lime being the most pronounced it has been, especially within the finish. There's a slightly heavier peach quality to it, but an overall improvement to the cup. And that's one of the reasons that this coffee did catch my attention. It's because it did have that peach note. So I was kind of skeptical to see if there's going to be any sort of peachiness to it. And I could see it, though it came a little bit more in a heavier sense as opposed to the softer, more fresh fruit forward experience that I typically am hoping for or expecting when it comes to peach notes within coffees. Nonetheless, intensity in this one as well. We continue on to day 29 as we opted for the V60 with lower temperatures, and the coffee is the best it has been up to this point, as it was offering better structure, including the milk chocolate base having greater definition to it. There's an abundance of fruit characteristics as well, and a slightly tropical sense, lending itself to just a better experience. Continue on to day 32 as we opted for the Chemex with the same adjustments, and I definitely had a slight preference towards the V60 based off of these two adjustments, as this cup focused much more on the chocolate aspect of things with less definition to the slight tropical fruit brightness that had been previously at the forefront of it. It's still there, though maybe not quite as intense or quite as defined through this brew method. We continue on to day 35 as we opted for the V60 with lower temperatures once again, and there's more success with this method as it's remaining on the slightly cleaner side of things, so the citric qualities seem even more accentuated with the strong chocolate base. The other fruit aspects were a little bit more subtle. Those are the two notes that I would say are most pronounced and most prominent within this coffee, that lime-like aspect that really seems to kind of dominate a lot of the attributes within this coffee, and then that very structured milk chocolate base to it. So like a chocolate lime sort of thing going against each other, and then you feel the other fruits much more in the background of it. We continue on to day 40 as we opted for the Chemex with the same adjustments, and the cup continues to remain mostly similar, though there was definitely a preference towards the V60 as the lime-like brightness and stronger chocolate base are a little better on this day, so I feel like this coffee is just improving with time. but the V60 experiences we had just seemed a little bit better. And that's why on day 43, we opted for one last try through the V60, and it continues to offer a relatively clean cup for a honey processed coffee, with the citric components being the most pronounced. And I think what helps with this coffee is it's still a heavier coffee as one might expect, but outside of that, the structure to the base of the coffee, specifically that chocolate attribute and the definition of the lime attribute, definitely gives it some clarity and a nice starting point in terms of the cleanliness for this coffee in general. Slight nuttiness, a bit of traditional chocolate and caramel characteristics as well, some subtle tropicality and peachiness in the finish. I think that's just kind of the best way to summarize this coffee. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s. Let's go through those. And I'm not going to lie, looking at this tasting wheel, I'm surprised I put it cleanliness at the level 4, but let's go through it. We'll start with the cleanliness, level 4. As I'm drinking this coffee today, I think it's very generous. I'll give it that. I think maybe because it is a honey processed El Salvadorian coffee, and for the life of me, I can't envision honey processed El Salvadorian coffees scoring level 4s too often in terms of the cleanliness. Maybe that's why I bumped it up. As I'm drinking it today, I'm like, that's generous. It's maybe on the higher side of level 3. That's probably where it belongs. But once again, I think I was just being really generous in this tasting wheel. Level 4 for cleanliness, that's where we put it. Let's continue. Finish, level 4. Even with the very strong citric intensity to it, especially within the finish, it does not linger too much after that. So it has a nice even finish to it. Don't necessarily have too much to add to that. Let's move on. Sweetness, level 4. I feel like that's me being generous once again, as it is a sweet coffee. It is a little bit more processed of a coffee, being a honey processed coffee. And I don't think that the theme of this coffee was ever meant to focus on the sweeter aspects of it. Though I think, once again, this might just be expectations and overall intensity to it, because it did have a little bit of the caramelized sweetness to it, a little bit of the chocolate sweetness, a little bit of the nuttiness, and some fruit sweetness. So I think that's just maybe a little bit of generosity once again, scoring it there at that level 4. Let's move on to true level 4s. Citrus level 4. Lime-like aspect about as pronounced and defined as possible. So yes, it definitely does belong there at that level 4. As does the chocolate, as the well-structured, well-defined chocolate base is an ever-present component within this one. As I kind of mentioned, those really seemed to dominate the entirety of this coffee, and they are the most justified there at that level 4 mark. Let's move on. Acidity, level 3. Kind of surprised that this coffee is maybe not necessarily quite as bright. There's a fair bit of that citric quality to it, though I do have to say that making this coffee in terms of the tasting wheel side by side with the Cramo, I was surprised to find that that one had a little bit more brightness to it. I tried to tone down both of those coffees, and that's why it's kind of interesting that that one still seemed to score a little higher in terms of the brightness than this one did. So don't really know what to make of that, but the brightness did score there at that level 3 mark. Let's move on. Spice, level 3, and that seems to be a little bit of a theme when it comes to Pacamara coffees, is that I do seem to get this spiced quality to them, and this one was certainly no exception, as there's much more of that spiced chocolate. Will always seem to be a continuous theme apparently when it comes to Pacamara coffees, so definitely there at that level 3. Let's move on. Saltiness, level 3. Surprisingly, a little bit more of a salty component. Once again, when making this taste, I said there's a little bit of saltiness to it. And I think that also comes in a little bit of the nutty sense, which you can also see in the savoriness. So there at that level 3 mark, feels justified. Let's move on. Berry fruit, level 3. I feel like it's something that I didn't necessarily mention too much. They have a kiwi note on here. I don't necessarily see that, but I rarely actually taste a well-structured kiwi in any coffee. It's a note that's pretty much eluded me for the entirety of my coffee career. But outside of that, I do have to say that there's a darker berry aspect to it. You can see something like grape or just a darker berry in general. We move on to the stone fruit, level 3. As I kind of mentioned, a little bit more of a heavier peach, and for that reason, you can maybe align it a little closer with something like an apricot as opposed to a true peach. But there's a stone fruit in this one without a doubt. Caramel, level 3. That's a little bit more in line with the expectations, even if there's a little bit more processing to it, as there was a nice caramelized aspect within this coffee that kind of went alongside of the nuttiness as well as the chocolate component, which I think has a little bit more to do with the origin of this coffee than anything else. But yes, definitely a little bit of the caramel to it. Savoriness, already mentioned, and we'll move on to the body at the level 3, as it is definitely a little bit more medium bodied than... Well, honestly, that's exactly what I was expecting with it to kind of score at that mark. So that's right in line with the expectations. As I'm looking at this tasting wheel, though, that's all the level 3s and level 4s. I don't think that there's anything else worth discussing. I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I think it definitely exceeded my expectations for a honey processed El Salvadorian coffee. I think the way that this coffee could have been better is if I was able to get much more of the peachiness to it in a much cleaner sense. But if this coffee is actually scoring a level 4, which I scored in this tasting wheel and I'm disagreeing with myself as we're talking about it, then it definitely far exceeded the expectations that I had for it, because I said if I can get it on the higher side of level 3, lower side of level 4, which is exactly what it ended up being, then that's going to be a victory in itself. And it did. So for that reason, it's definitely one of the more enjoyable El Salvadorian coffees I've had this year. Though I do have to say that it's nothing that's going to be overly memorable for me in the long-term future, as I thought it was nice, just maybe a little bit more intense than I like, still a little bit more funky and fermenting than I necessarily like, as I just wanted a little bit more structure and definition specifically to the fruit aspects of it. Lime's nice, not a big citrus fan. Chocolate's okay, not a big chocolate fan. So those being the dominant aspects of this coffee are never going to endear itself to me. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to: anybody that likes those two aspects, specifically the lime and the chocolate aspect of it, because they are very pronounced, they're very well defined, and they are ever-present components within this one right from the onset. Outside of that, you do get some nice steps to it in terms of some classic origin characteristics, that of course being the nuttiness, chalkiness, and caramel aspect, and then also some much more, we'll say, process-focused characteristics in terms of the fruit intensity, as you do have a little bit of that berry aspect and a little bit of the stone fruit aspect as well, giving this one a little bit of both worlds and not too much of either of those worlds. I think that's the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Los Angeles honey processed El Salvador from Father's Coffee Roastery. Thank you for watching.